For our pivoting sample, we are going to use a sample square of fabric. I'm also going to be using a seam gauge and a marking pen. These two tools are not necessary, but they are helpful. First off, make sure your stitch width is at 2.5 and your stitch width is 0. This is what the settings are on your machine when you first turn it on. It says on number 2, on a sample piece of fabric, you will sew a square as one continuous seam. So that is really important to make sure that you're getting all the points, is to make sure that as you sew this this square here, it is one seam. You're not stopping at the corners, cutting your threads, and then going another direction. That this is all one big stitch. You're going to be pivoting at each corner with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now that can be the hardest part, is knowing when do I change direction. So I'm going to use my seam gauge and I'm going to set it at the 5/8 inch line. So that is 5 of these little marks on the side of them, because each one is 1/8 of an inch. And I'm just going to go ahead and mark where the 5/8 inch point is here. And the 5/8 inch point is here. So where these two lines would come together is where my corner is that I would pivot. And I can mark each side, but I'm also going to show you on the sewing machine how you can find that 5/8 inch line without having to use your marking pen or the seam gauge. One of the other things that you're going to want to notice is that there's a thick line right here with some instructions pointing to it. Overlap where you started to secure the seam. So on this one, we're not actually back stitching, but we're going to start right about here. We'll sew our square, and then when we come back, we're just going to trace over our stitching line again, and basically that's going to do the same function as back stitching of just locking in those seams. So I'm ready to start my pivoting sample, and to do that I'm going to start on the middle of one side of my fabric, and I'm going to be using the 5/8 inch line over on the right side to guide my fabric as I go through. So as I start in the middle, this will also be my ending point, so I'll go all the way around and then kind of trace back into my same stitching line. Now coming up is the line where we marked of where we need to pivot. So as we get a little bit closer to that pivot point, I'm just going to slow down a bit and maybe do it stitch by stitch so that I can get close to where that 5/8 mark is. That's about where we're at. And so now I turned my hand wheel so that my needle is all the way down in the fabric. I'm going to lift up my presser foot, and now I'm going to turn it. If you are slightly off of your new turn being 5/8, you'll be okay. Just get as close to it as you possibly can. And then we're going to continue on with our next side. Now this next side, I did not mark my corner here, but there is a way on your sewing machine to understand where that 5/8 inch pivot point is. So to do that, I'm going to get a little bit closer on the presser foot, and especially with the needle stitch plate. Now you'll notice that there is a horizontal line just below where it says 5/8, 3/8, not the edge of the needle stitch plate, but just inside of it. That actually is your 5/8 pivot point. So as I get close to the edge, again, I'm going to kind of slow down just so I can make sure that I'm getting each one, and I think with my next stitch I'm gonna be there. So when my fabric is lined up with this line down at the bottom, that's how I know it's my 5/8 pivot point. If I were going for a 1/4 of an inch, if I were lining it up on the outside edge, when I would sew, I'd sew up until the point where my presser feet toes come together. That would be my 1/4 of an inch. But for right now, we're just going to worry about the 5/8 inch. So I'm going to pick up my presser foot, I'm going to turn, and look at that, I'm ready to go on my 5/8 inch seam allowance line. So I'm just going to continue on. Now sometimes it happens with students, I actually think I'm running out of thread here, that I'm out of thread. They go too far down. They totally miss the mark. Just reverse it till you get to the point where you're at and you can pivot. We're going to be slightly over, and that's okay. and then you would continue on from there. I ran out of bobbin thread, so we're going to stop that example right there. Okay, we have new bobbin thread now, so we're ready to be in business. And this is just a good example of what do you do when you run out of thread in the middle of a seam. You don't want to unpick everything you did. This is fine. We did good on these corners. We don't want to completely just disregard that work that we just did. So I'm going to basically just backtrack a little bit. Let's get this through our presser foot towards the back. And I'm just going to trace over my stitches about an inch or so of where I ended. That way just the stitches can still be kind of locked in, and we'll just continue on. So as I get to my 5/8 line, like I was showing before, what if I go way past the mark where I should have pivoted at? So actually right here, see how this is lined up? The edge of my fabric is lined up with the inside toes of my presser foot where they come together. That would be our 1/4 of an inch pivot point, but we needed it at 5/8. So I'm just going to back it up. I'm not going to cut my threads, but I'm just going to push and hold that reverse button till it gets to the point that I'm at my 5/8 inch pivot point. Put my needle down, lift up my presser foot, and pivot. If you're slightly off, honestly, I think it's more of my fabric's not cut straight, and that's okay. We're eventually just going to bring it back. I want to see that you can understand what to do if there is an issue. Can you make it work? And I'm really looking for those pivot techniques at your corners. I'm going to do one more. Again, you can use the line on your needle stitch plate, or you can actually mark it with a marking pen. Now I'm coming back to where I started, and I need to be a little concerned. Yes, I probably should have cut these, but I'm in the habit of doing everything at the end. So I'm just going to hold these threads out to the side so that they don't get jammed in with the rest of the fabric. All right, and I'm just tracing over my stitches again, so it's basically locked in. Those are not going to come apart. So now I can take my scissors and cut off all the loose edges, and in this one I have a few more since I stopped in the middle of a side. Trim off all those loose threads, both sides.